For we contend not against flesh and blood, but against the principalities, against the powers, against the world rulers of this present darkness, against the spiritual host of wickedness in the heavenly places. From the American Midwest comes This Present Darkness, where we explore the supernatural aspects of the paranormal from a Catholic perspective and expose the dark forces in our world and beyond, both seen and unseen. Now, here's your host, historian, paranormal investigator, author, and ghost lorist, Ursula Bielski.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the show. My name's Ursula Bielski. For those of you who are new here, I'm a 35-something years veteran paranormal investigator, historian, folklorist, and a lifelong Catholic. And here on This Present Darkness, we look at all things paranormal from a Catholic perspective. And I'm so glad you're here. And I hope that you'll join us often, either on YouTube with the visual or for the audio only on our Buzzsprout podcast. So you have both of those versions. If, like me, you like to lie in bed at night and listen to podcasts while you fall asleep, you can definitely tune into Buzzsprout. But I love to have you here where you can see all the crazy faces I make while I'm talking about these crazy things. So thank you so much for being here. Today, we are talking about a very fascinating subject in parapsychology, and that is the supernatural, and that is the manifestation or presence otherwise of seemingly physical objects in cases of paranormal activity, paranormal manifestations, paranormal cases of all kinds. This is something that I've been looking at a lot in the past year or so, that I've been looking more closely at both the UFO enigma and demonology and cases of infestations and possessions and obsession in the field of especially Catholic demonology, of course. And it's something that seems just at odds, you know, that you would be studying something that is apparently supernatural in origin, such as demonic manifestations, and have physical objects that not only appear, but remain. And in parapsychology, these are called permanent paranormal objects, or PPOs. They are objects that appear seemingly paranormally and they remain. And so we have cases of these all throughout parapsychology, but it wasn't at first that I made that connection when I first started looking into the UFO enigma about a year ago now. And I was very quick, you know, someone Christian, obviously, and Catholic. We've talked already on this series about the weird propensity of the Catholic Church and the Vatican in particular to support the idea of aliens as spacemen, which is very different from what most of the Christian church is looking at these things as, and that is something malevolent, diabolical, demonic, whatever you want to call it. And so I have a whole episode about that if you want to look it up a couple weeks back, where I talked about this. And for me, it was not hard for me to go with the other Christian churches, not the Catholic Church, and to say, you know, I don't really buy the spaceman thing like the Vatican seems to be doing and the church at large seems to be doing. I don't buy that at all. And I went through a lot of the different reasons why I don't buy into that. So it was very easy for me to accept this idea that this is some kind of a spiritual thing that's going on with not only the abduction experiences that so many, now apparently millions of people have had and continue to have, but also even the flying saucer stuff. Now, there have been a number of prominent researchers into the UFO enigma that are also religious scholars who have separated the abduction phenomena from the flying saucer stuff. And they have said, Michael Heiser, who just passed away a couple of weeks ago, jumps to mind. We've talked about him a lot on the show. Dr. Michael Heiser, author of The Unseen Realm. I'm actually going to give that book away later this week on when I do a review of that book. So make sure you subscribe to the channel. But he did a show called Aliens and Demons documentary. It's on, you can watch it on YouTube for free. It's great. I highly recommend it. But he talks a lot about the different possibilities for what was going on at Roswell, which he does not believe were alien bodies recovered. He does believe there's some sort of a demonic something at play, and especially the abduction phenomena, at least a lot of it, not all of it. But he believes that the crash material that's recovered in some of these situations, the photographs that people take and videos that people take of these UFOs or UAPs, as they are now calling them, the flying saucers, are not from the same phenomenon, not the same grouping. He believes that these are, for the most part, either governmental things, our government or another government, that these are research programs, aerial craft that are being designed by some government on Earth, or that they are from the private sector, the private research and development sector, which I think a lot of it is that also, but I don't think it accounts for all of it. And I do think that some of it is actually what I would call, what we would call paraphysical phenomena, that these are spiritual in origin, but they do have a physical, they come into our physical dimension, they go in and out of it. And, you know, there are even secular scientists, atheistic scientists, or at least agnostic scientists as well, like Jacques Vallée, for example, famous ufologist, who is not by any stretch of the imagination a Christian or a believer of any kind, but he has believed for decades that these alien phenomena are malevolent in origin, and that they have some kind of a plan that they are trying to put over on us with some sort of deception. So, and they're trying to, it's some kind of control of humanity. So I'm not a religious wacko in my ideas about this by any stretch of the imagination. So at any rate, so I've gotten involved in the past year or so in looking at these instances in cases of the paranormal, the supernatural, where there are physical objects that manifest, either come in and out or remain behind. And we see this also in, and I haven't seen anyone bring this up, in cases of demonic possession. And very famously, Father Gabriel Amort, who passed away a couple of years ago now, who was the Vatican exorcist for many years, wrote extensively about this, as have other exorcists, about how in some cases of possession, the possession victim will vomit or regurgitate, not regurgitate because they didn't eat them in the first place, but they will expel physical objects such as broken glass, nails, screws, and things like this. And this is not an uncommon occurrence in the cases of the process of exorcism. So that's another interesting thing to look at. Very, very specifically spiritual instance of something paranormal, paranormal cases where physical objects are part of what comes out of it. I'm going to talk a little bit later about another very religious circumstance that we've talked about before, but I'm going to mention it again, where there is a very physical presence of something that's spiritual in nature. A lot of these manifestations are what we call apports, and apports are objects that appear usually during a seance or some kind of situation where there's a medium present, a spiritual medium present. And these apports have been considered part of the physical mediumship or physical phenomena of mediumship. And this was very much in style back at the beginnings of the spiritualist movement after 1848, where this came to be one of the things that people actually expected when they went and sat in on seances. They expected the medium to produce physical objects, including objects they could actually touch. And so we had, during these seances, well into the 20th century, many seances included the mediums producing things like jewelry, precious gems, and lost objects, things that people had lost that were sitting on the seance that would reappear during the seance. But there were also really crazy things that would appear too, such as live plants, flowers, plants that seemed to germinate and grow before the eyes of the sitters at the seance. There was one medium who actually produced fruits and vegetables on demand. She went around the seance table and she asked each person to request that she produce or the spirits produce a fruit or vegetable of their choice, which she apparently did in the order in which they were requested. So you had a lot of things like this going on. Live animals became also something that was often produced during seances, starting with a white dove. The manifestation of the white dove actually predates the spiritualist movement itself. We have accounts of this actually happening in the 1830s, 2 decades before the first spiritualistic manifestations in Hydesville, New York, the Fox sisters. And we had an instance where a white dove was seen, not by everyone in the seance circle, but by one of they weren't called mediums yet at that time, but one of the, sensitives, somnambules, they called them. And she said that she saw this white dove flitting about the room and that it had a piece of paper in her hand and that the dove had dropped the paper onto the floor. And this observer that was sitting in on this circle, wasn't called a seance yet, but was sitting in on this somnambule circle. He picked up this piece of paper that sure enough was on the floor where the person had indicated. And the piece of paper had bits of bone that were glued to it. And it had the names of 3 saints on it. And it seemed to indicate that these were relics or pieces of bone fragments from these saints. And this was, again, this is not unique in the annals of spiritual or physical mediumship. These are things that happen on a regular basis at the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of seance circles that were going on in the late 19th century all over the world. There was even one medium that produced a live shark during a seance and other very fascinating things. But he was later found to have been secreting birds and things in his private parts, which was something that was very common for a lot of mediums to do, to hide these objects in their various orifices where they could produce them, from which they could produce them fraudulently later. And so this was one of the things that led so many mediums to be dismissed as completely fraudulent, even though, as parapsychologists, we really don't dismiss people outright because of that, because it seems that in a lot of these different cases, we've seen this in poltergeist cases and a lot of different cases where paranormal activity seems to be going on, where there is some kind of physical agent, whether a poltergeist agent or a spiritual medium or whatever, that at some point, almost everyone resorts to fraud because the demand for manifestations becomes so strong from researchers, observers, etc., that it seems like almost everyone resorts to fraud at some time or another. So, and that leads skeptics and scientists, of course, to dismiss all of the manifestations, which I don't think is fair. And a lot of people don't think is fair, but it's been a constant problem with the study of parapsychology throughout, well over 100 years now, getting on 200 years now. And so physical mediumship really began to fall out of fashion, I guess you would say, after about the 1920s, because, so many people had been revealed to be frauds. So people didn't trust it. And people, of course, didn't want to be, the mediums didn't want to be, because, people just didn't trust it anymore. We saw with the Scole experiments, we talked about this a few weeks ago, which took place in Norfolk, I gave a lecture on this a few weeks ago that took place in Norfolk in the 1990s, that the Scole Experiment was specifically an effort to bring back or to save physical mediumship from completely being lost. And they did seem to have some success at doing this. In my lecture a few weeks ago, I went over the many different apports that were produced during the Scole sittings, including lots of jewelry and coins and things like that, and a seemingly brand new, pristine newspaper from decades before that wasn't yellowed or deteriorated at all. And then very famously, not exactly an apport, but definitely a physical manifestation, the imprinting of apparently sealed rolls of 35 millimeter film with all kinds of different writings and pictures and things like that. So the jury's still out on whether the Scole Experiment was legit or not, or partially fraudulent or not. But there are a lot of investigators that sat in on the Scole Experiments, including my mentor from back in the day, Dr. Stephen Braude, who I met on one of those old listservs. Remember those, the pre-internet, when I was back in grad school in the 1990s. Dr. Braude is a philosopher and a parapsychologist, and he spent most of his time teaching at the University of Maryland in Baltimore County. And so, yeah, he became a mentor to me, and he's written some very fascinating books because his specialty in parapsychology, or I should say one of his main specialties, is physical mediumship. And he investigated not only the Scole Experiment, but a lot of other very famous cases in modern recent years, including the Amityville Horror and, very high profile cases like that. Stephen Braude had arranged in recent years to have brought to the archives at the University of Maryland in Baltimore County all of the papers of a parapsychologist named Eucharistic Eisenbud, who had dedicated a lot of his life's work to studying a Chicago man named Ted Sirius, who many believed could imprint images from his mind onto Polaroid film. If you're from the Chicago area, you might have grown up hearing about Ted, or if you were just into the paranormal when you were a kid growing up in the 1970s, because he was often featured on shows like In Search Of, all of those great old shows that we loved. And Ted was a just kind of ne'er-do-well Chicago bellhop who worked at the Congress Hotel here in Chicago, famous haunted hotel, right? And I think he was sitting in a doctor's office one day waiting for an appointment, and there was a Polaroid camera on the receptionist's desk, and he picked it up and he just pointed it at himself and took a picture. And instead of it being a picture of him, there was a picture of, it was like the Taj Mahal or something in India. And so he took another one, and it was an image of something else again. So he realized that he had this ability to imprint psychic images onto film. He attracted the attention of several parapsychologists, and one of them, Eucharistic Eisenbud, traveled to Chicago, and he met with Ted in a hotel room at the Palmer House Hotel here on State Street. And he began to study Ted at length. And this went into years and years of research that Dr. Eisenbud did with Ted Sirius. He discovered very quickly on that very first night at the Palmer House that Ted needed to be inebriated in order to produce these results. So a lot of the research monies that Eucharistic Eisenbud got to study Ted went to literally buying him liquor. At any rate, I'm going to put a link in the description so that you can check out these amazing photographs, or thoughtographs as they're referred to, that Ted supposedly produced during his years. And of course, many people accused him of fraud. He would use this gadget. It was like a little tube. He called it his gizmo, that he said that he needed to focus the energy from his mind onto the film in the camera. And a lot of people said that he was fraudulently like secreting images or something in here. It's all crazy, the kinds of things that they said. But at any rate, Ted later on was found to be doing things fraudulently, but it didn't account for, as in many of these cases, a lot of the earlier things that he had done, which were very carefully very carefully observed and monitored conditions. But one of the very first parapsychology books I ever read when I was like in middle school back in Chicago, that I took out of the old Hill Library on Lincoln Avenue, was a book called The World of Ted Sirius, which was all about, by Yule Eisenbud, about the amazing research that he had done with Ted over those many years. Much later, after I had become a student of parapsychology myself, this was in recent years, this is probably back in 2014, a colleague of mine, Michael Esposito, who, as you may know, does a lot of EVP research and incorporates it into experimental music. He and I spent a night in a room at the Palmer House Hotel, attempting to collect EVP, or electronic voice phenomena, from Ted Sirius, Yule Eisenbach, and the other investigators that were there during that first night. We got some interesting results. We were using a reel-to-reel tape recorder. Remember, I do not condone this anymore, but it was definitely interesting. And I did make a piece of experimental music inspired by Ted Sirius, and I'll link to that and down here too. You can listen to it on SoundCloud. But at any rate, my point is that I was interested, this was one of the first things that that piqued my interest in parapsychology, was Ted Sirius and those thoughtographs. And getting back to Stephen Braude, he was able to get all of Yule Eisenbach's papers and everything else that he had collected around the study of Ted Sirius into the archives of the University of Maryland at Baltimore County. And so you can go there in the archives now and actually touch the camera, the Polaroid camera that Ted used to produce these photographs. And you can see all of the original photographs and the negatives that Ted produced. So it's pretty cool. Another instance that is very similar to this, and in the case of permanent paranormal objects, is, or at least so far they're permanent, is the so-called faces of Belmez. And this is a well-known case in the annals of parapsychology, in which this little house in Spain, the town of Belmez in Spain, since 1971, these human faces have appeared on the floor, all over the floors of the house, by seemingly paranormal means. And there's no apparent explanation for it. A lot of people, of course, have accused the family of fraud, of trying to make money off of it, and so forth. But there still is no explanation for why these faces appeared. One of the most interesting things about the faces is that when they first appear, they're very sharp images, very detailed, and over time they seem to get fuzzy and fade away. And it's not from wear, like walking on them. It just seems to be that, like, an inherent nature of the picture. It's almost like the energy isn't as strong or something like that, to make as clear of a picture. Reminded me of one of the cases of apports in physical mediumship. In the case of a seance, there was one case where during a seance, and this was back late 19th or early 20th century, when there was a seance that had been going on for quite some time, and the medium was getting tired, and she claimed that her control, or that her person in the spirit world that was helping her, that they were both getting tired. And so they were about to wind up, but one of the sitters or observers requested that the medium and her control apport a little brick of pyrite metal that was sitting, at home in the office on the desk of this sitter or observer. And so the medium said, well, we're both tired, but we'll try. And so The medium went through, after a few minutes, went through these. Oftentimes the mediums will or would go through these, must have these like muscle spasms before, almost like a minor seizure, before the apported objects would appear during the seance. And so everyone perceived the medium give this sort of, shudder that she would do before an object would apport. But nothing, they didn't hear anything fall. Normally they would hear a big thud as the object hit the table or hit the floor. And this is very common with apports of objects during seances, but they didn't hear anything. So they turn on all the lights, and no, the block of pyrite had not fallen on the table or the floor, but everyone in the seance circle and the entire seance table was covered with this fine covering of pyrite dust, as they found out it was later. And the observer, the sitter, that was when she returned home, or he returned home later, found that there was a chunk out of this block of pyrite that he had on his office desk, which he had requested the medium and her control to apport into the seance room. That's the story, folks. That's all I can tell you. That's all I can tell you. One of, as you know, one of my favorite cases that intrigues me so much in recent studies, 20th century, 21st century, is the case of the so-called devil in Texas, which was the case that we've talked about on This Present Darkness when we did our episode called Letters from Hell. This was a case that was investigated by Hans Holzer in Tyler, Texas in the 1970s. During which, over the course of months, or it might have even been over a year, there were scores and scores, if not hundreds, of letters and notes that fell out of thin air in the house of the Baird family in Tyler, Texas. And it was a tragic case. We found out recently because they went back to this case on the show, The Holzer Files, which reopened some of Holzer's cases with his daughter, Alexandra, who also is a paranormal researcher today, a friend of mine. And Alexandra brought some of these letters that are still in her father's files for the cast of the show to look at before they went and reinvestigated this case. But it turns out, very sadly, that the young man who seemed to be, if you want to call it a poltergeist case, I don't, but if you want to call it a poltergeist case, that this young man was at the center of it. It turned out that later on, and Hans Holzer included this in his book Ghosts, like that Bible of his cases, that huge black book called Ghosts. He did not, of course, know this. He passed away before this happened, but this young man actually went on to claim to his family members, his sister, that he felt he was possessed by the devil, and he later committed suicide, very tragically. So again, I don't consider this a poltergeist case. I consider it a possession case, but there was a lot of poltergeist phenomena going on in that house, including the apports of this endless stream of letters and notes from the air inside the house, and the apports of things like bugs, like hundreds of what seemed to be mummified bugs that would fall out of the air in the bedroom when the father or the son turned out the lights in the bedroom. So a lot of interesting things that appeared in that case. This was very similar to a case I discovered just a few years ago that occurred here in the Chicago area in Lamont, just southwest of Chicago, on the Willmans family farm. This was very similar to the Devil in Texas case, in which the family in Lamont was sitting around the farmhouse dinner table one day, and this letter fell like down from the ceiling and landed in the middle of the dining room table. And it was a threatening letter written like in a child's hand, saying that the family had to get out of the house or harm was going to come to them. And these letters went on and on and on, even after they removed the jar. This was in 1901. They had one bottle of ink in the house. They removed the bottle of ink from the house, and the letters continued, but they were written in the laundry bluing that the mother would use to do the laundry. They removed all of the paper from the house, and they found that on Sunday, when the mom was looking for her hat to go to church, her hat box had a piece cut out of it. And when they were at Sunday dinner later that day, that piece of a hat box fell onto the dining room table with a note written on it. And these were all, laughing, sarcastic notes, from this, whatever this entity was that was writing these notes, was making fun of them trying to stop it. And they too ended up calling in an exorcist to help with this case. And I don't know if any of them were ever successful. The first exorcism was not successful. I know that from the newspaper articles. And we don't know what became of the demon of Lamont, as I call it. But it was very similar to that Devil in Texas case. When we come back, we're going to take a short break. And when we come back, I'm going to share with you one of the most interesting things from my own experience growing up here in Chicago, which concerns the apports of an apport is something. And I'll share that with you and some additional stories when we come back from this break. So come right back here. This is This Present Darkness. All right. And we are back. I'm Ursula Bielski. Thanks for being here on This Present Darkness. We are talking about physical objects that appear in cases of apparently supernatural, paranormal, spiritual stuff going on. Sometimes the objects appear briefly and then disappear, and sometimes they appear and they remain as permanent paranormal objects. One of the things that I talk about often when I talk about Chicago ghost stories is the case of two different cases here in Chicago where these handprints, ghostly handprints, have apparently been left behind. And you might be familiar with these cases. One of them is actually related to the case of Resurrection Mary, our famous vanishing hitchhiker ghost that traipses along Archer Avenue, southwest of Chicago, one of the many vanishing hitchhikers that have been reported all over the world. A lot of people have encountered this spirit known as Resurrection Mary, whatever she is, over the years, tried to give her a ride home in their cars. They all say she looks as real as you or I until she vanishes from the car or jumps out of the moving car and runs through the locked cemetery gates, or does other supernatural tricks before their eyes. But there was one night in particular in the 1970s when a gentleman, truck driver, driving by Resurrection Cemetery saw someone, a young girl, clutching the bars of the cemetery, the locked gates. And he went to the police, who met him at the gates, and the girl was gone. But the bars that she had been clutching had been pried apart by some unbelievable force, these bronze bars, and seared into the bars, the metal of the bars. It looked like handprints, like you could see where the fingers had burned in through the bars. And some people who saw those handprints before they were mostly soldered out said you could actually see the fingerprints burned into the metal. And there were a lot of people who claimed to have seen that. Now, the cemeteries tried to repair the bars many different times, but there would always be this blackened area that would come back where the handprints had been. And actually, you could still go there up until a couple of years ago and feel the slight indentation where the handprints had been, even though the bars had been repaired many times. And you could see where the veneer was pulling away from the bottoms of the bars where they had been soldered back in place so many times after repairs. I believe one of the bars was stolen or removed a few years ago, and then the other one as well. And I haven't been down there in the last few years since the beginning of the pandemic. So I'm not really sure what the situation is now, if their bars are there now or not. I'll report on that later. I'll be going down to St. James later this month, and I'll stop by there and let you guys know what's going on. But yeah, those handprints were very interesting. And we have a similar case here in Chicago. This is the case known as the or story known as the Hand of Death, or the firefighter's ghostly handprint. And this was the story of firefighter Frank Levy, who was killed in an office building fire in 1924 on Good Friday. And he was one of 8 firefighters who actually died in this fire. And the day after the fire and the death of Frank, the firefighters were sitting around, and one of his buddies there told everyone that Frank had been washing the windows of the firehouse with him the day before, when he rested his soapy hand on the bay window, and said that it was his last day on the fire department. So he predicted that this was going to be his last day on the fire department. And before his friend could ask him what he meant by this, the alarm came in for the office fire, and Frank never returned from the fire. So he had prophesied his own death while he was resting his hand on the window. And the next day, they saw that place where he had rested his hand while he made this prognostication of his own death, there was a black handprint embedded in the window, and they couldn't wash it off or scrape it off or get it off with chemicals. And that handprint was there for 20 years until the window was broken. It's a very famous story that's still told by firefighters all over the world. But there's a little museum in Rome that I think I might have talked about before. I know I've blogged about it before. I think it's called the Museum of the Most Holy Souls in Purgatory. And the museum is in this church. And the only artifacts in the museum, or exhibits in the museum, are objects that have been burned by the handprints of ghosts who have appeared to people while they have asked for prayers and masses to be released from purgatory. And we've talked about purgatory a lot on this show in the past. This place Catholics believe we go to when we die to await prayers to purify us, so that we can go before God and live with God forever. And it's really interesting. This museum has many artifacts with these black handprints on them. And these I would definitely consider permanent paranormal objects that have been left behind after visitations from human spirits, or at least alleged visitations from human spirits, if you're on the fence about that. Another whole group of experiences or reports that has to be included with all of this is the Eucharistic miracles that I've already done a whole show about on This Present Darkness. You can go back last year. It was one of our first shows that we did, probably a year ago now. You can find it on the YouTube version or on the audio version on Buzzsprout. These are a series of miracles, alleged miracles that have occurred over literally centuries at different Catholic churches around the world, in which the Eucharistic host has been seen to bleed. And tissue samples taken from this blood have been given, some of them have been given to secular cardiologists who are not told anything about the source of the tissue. And these cardiologists, some of them, most of them, who are at least agnostic, a lot of them atheists, have said not only that they're all the same blood type, but they are not just blood, but heart tissue. And that the patient that the tissue was taken from was undergoing severe bodily trauma when the tissue sample was taken. So this blood that has appeared, and several of these Eucharistic miracles have been reported just in the last year since I did that show, believe it or not. So like I always tell you guys, things are amping up now. You got to get with the program, get right with God, right? These blood samples, they all point to that it's the same person, same blood type, same kind of tissue, same trauma that the body is going through. So similar, right? And of course, Catholics believe that the Eucharist at the moment of consecration during Mass, at the moment of consecration, we witness and celebrate again the eternal, once and forever sacrifice of Jesus on the cross at Calvary. And so that Eucharist, that bread, is turned into the body of Jesus Christ as he is suffering and dying on the cross of Calvary. So it's pretty interesting, I would say. Now, I told you that when I came back, I was going to tell you a rather personal story about my own experience with apports. And this was something really crazy that happened after one of my uncles passed away. And some of you know a little bit about my paranormal family history that I've written and talked about over these many years now. And I don't think I've talked too much, though, about this particular uncle. My Uncle Joe was one of my mom's, 5 brothers and sisters, and 6 brothers and sisters, actually, if you count the baby who passed away of pneumonia when she was very little, just a few weeks old, who we actually heard this baby crying. I've mentioned in the past, when we would stay overnight at my grandma's house when we were little, we would hear a baby crying. But from the room where this baby had apparently passed away, so a century before, basically. But my Uncle Joe was one of my mom's brothers. Her other brother, Will, as you may recall, was in World War II along with my Uncle Gene. And Uncle Will was a poet and he was a pacifist, but he was on the boat going off to war when Pearl Harbor was bombed. And he never came home. He was gone for 4 years. And I've told the story before that he appeared in the bedroom of his parents, my grandparents, at the moment of his death, dressed in his uniform. And my poor grandparents thought he had come home finally after 4 years. But the next day they got a telegram from the War Department saying that he had been killed in an explosion on the airfield on Saipan Island, where he'd been stationed. And they saw him in the bedroom the night before, and they jumped up to greet him, and he vanished before their eyes. So they thought they had somehow had this dream together at the same time about him, but it was something very different. Meanwhile, my Uncle Joe did not go to war. He had scarlet fever when he was a baby, and the family said he was never quite right after that. He was an artist, and he was an amazing artist. He was a carpenter also, like my grandfather, and he carved all of us these beautiful crushes for Christmas for all of my cousins and my aunts and uncles. He carved one for each one of us. And I'll try to take a picture of one and put it on the on my blog, and put a link to it so you can see. Maybe you've seen these in pictures that I've posted of my Christmas decorations over the years, but he would actually carve all of the little bricks and then build the nativity or the crush out of these hand-carved individual little bricks. And he would also carve the trees and everything like that. He was just amazing. And when he passed away, his whole life, he slept up in the attic where he and his brothers had slept. It was a small house in a 2-flat here on the north side of Chicago. And he and his brothers, when they grew up, they slept up in the attic together. And he never married or had children. And he always stayed living with my grandmother until after her death, when he was the only one still living in the flat. And after his death, we found that he had painted these beautiful murals on the walls in the attic. And it was just really amazing. But he was also a great nature lover. And he seemed to have this way of taming animals. And oftentimes when we'd come over to visit my grandma, we would go out to visit my Uncle Joe out, and he would hang out in the garage often. And he would often have like raccoons, squirrels, rabbits, pigeons, all sorts of animals that he had coerced into the garage that he had tamed, and they would eat out of his hands and things like this. And it was always this marvelous thing to see. Uncle Joe was also always kind of this magical character. Every single morning, as long as anyone knew him, the first thing Uncle Joe would do in the morning was to come out onto the back porch, which overlooked the backyard from the second floor. And he would tear up one of those, remember those family size loaves of like Wonder Bread? I don't know if they still make those, probably, right? He would tear up a whole loaf of this bread and scatter it out in the backyard for the birds in the morning. He would do this every single day, first thing. And every night coming home, he would always go out and he would get a jug of wine and he would get this loaf of bread for the morning to feed the birds. So this was in the late 1980s. Like I said, Uncle Joe was the only one still living upstairs in my grandma's old 2-flat and still sleeping up in the attic like he always did. And so my aunt and uncle, my Aunt Franny and Uncle Norbert, lived on the ground floor. And they would always hear Uncle Joe going up to the attic to go to bed in the morning. And they would hear him come down from the attic in the morning. And so this one day, they did not hear Uncle Joe come down from the attic in the morning. And so my Uncle Norbert went up and they found that he had a heart attack and died during the night. So the day after my Uncle Joe passed away, my Uncle Norbert was coming out from under the back porch to take the garbage out to the alley. So he was going to walk through the backyard to the alley to take out the garbage. And as he came out from under the porch, he was showered with all of this torn up bread coming down from the porch where my Uncle Joe had stood every morning for years, feeding the birds with this bread. It was real bread, just like, torn up Wonder Bread. Amazing. And, I heard that story when I was at that point already doing research in parapsychology. I was, under the tutelage of Jim Horan at Benedictine University, where I had graduated from, and I was in grad school, and I was still doing some research with Jim and some of his other colleagues like Tim Hart and Michael Hollinshead. And it was amazing. It was really amazing to see. By that point, it was kind of, I had gotten to this point where, and I talked about this a couple of weeks ago, where I was kind of disappointed because a lot of the investigators that I had been working with were very scientific minded. And if something didn't register on, an EMF meter or a tri-field meter or a parabolic microphone, it was dismissed, as not real evidence. And I laughed to myself when my uncle told me about this. And I thought, is this evidence? Is this real evidence? Well, to me, it's real evidence. It's definitely real evidence to me. Well, I hope that you have enjoyed this look tonight at some of the instances of these physical objects, or at least paraphysical objects that appear, sometimes remain, in cases of alleged paranormal or supernatural activity. And I really hope that you'll keep these stories and these incidents in mind, these reports in mind as the months go by. And I think that we hear more about these kinds of physical objects being a part of the UAP or UFO phenomena in particular, because as we've already talked about extensively, I don't buy the idea that these are spacemen. I think this is some kind of a spiritual phenomena, malevolent spiritual phenomenon, and that the physical parts of it are definitely there to try and convince us of the physical reality of what this phenomenon is, what this enigma is, because as scientific-minded people, we demand that evidence, just like my colleagues did so many years ago. And I don't know where they would fit my uncle's breadcrumbs into that, but I think I think that one of the big problems today in studying things in general is that it's another one of the bad byproducts of the Enlightenment, is that the Enlightenment separated the spiritual from the physical. And that's how we look at everything. It's one or the other. And I don't think the record bears that out at all. You've seen a little portion of it in this episode tonight. And I don't think that the actual historical record and the way that things work evidences that kind of severe separation. I think there are a lot of instances where the physical and the spiritual overlap. And again, put this on the back burner for reference for what's coming down the pipe in the months and the years ahead, when I think we're going to see a lot more overlap of the spiritual and physical and the things that are going to come out in our world. Thank you so much for being here tonight with me. Like I said, you can always catch these episodes of This Present Darkness on YouTube for the audio visual version, or on Buzzsprout for the audio only. And I hope that you will like, share, comment, and spread all of this around, because I'd love to have more people here on the show. Please comment. I'd love to get conversation. We love it when we get conversations going. And you can email me too with questions, because I want to do a mailbag pretty soon. I'm at Ursula Bielski at sbcglobal.net. I'll put that down in the description, because no one's going to be able to spell it. And I hope to see you here next week for another episode of This Present Darkness. And until then, remember to pray for ghosts. I'm Ursula Bielski.
Thanks for listening to This Present Darkness. The video version of this podcast is available on Ursula Bielski's World of the Supernatural YouTube channel. Be sure to become a subscriber by signing up with Buzzsprout today. And remember to sign up for the World of the Supernatural mailing list at worldofthesupernatural.com for our monthly newsletter and more. And don't forget to support the podcast through Patreon.